Hi guys, we are so glad to see you here. Welcome to DotNext.
Hello,
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Hi, how are you
good
today?
to be here.
I'm great. I'm so excited about doing this talk. I really can't wait to get started.
Well,
So, Marco, I understand that you are going to tell us about authorization and authentication. There has been some rather recent developments in this topic, which probably will decrease the amount of pain that the developers experience during this uneasy process. So it's really exciting to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you what. So this talk condenses the two of my greatest passions at the moment. So one is security. As a web developer, I've always been involved in security matters, and Blazor, which is probably the coolest technology Microsoft has been working on for the last couple of years. So yeah, it's amazing. I can't wait to get started.
Marco, just one small question from me. You have a lot of experience as a speaker on different conferences. Are you still worrying before the start of the talk?
I do every time, especially when doing it remotely. You cannot see the audience, and becomes really challenging. So you can't establish the binding with the rest of the people. But I try to do my best.
Good luck.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I think we can get started. Let's start. Yeah. So guys, again, thanks a lot for being here. My name is Marco, and yeah, we're going to talk about Blazor and particularly about the authentication and authorization aspects of Blazor. And so, more specifically, what we're going to look at is well, first of all, we're going to have a glimpse of the object model that is related to security matters. And then we're going to have a look at how security works. First of all, in Blazor Server, you know that there are two flavors of Blazor. There's Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly. However, I'm not going to spend much time on Blazor Server because I think that Blazor WebAssembly is the most prominent technology of Blazor. So we're going to focus mostly on that, and we will see how different this is regarding to security, even though we can reuse pretty much the same concepts that we use in Blazor Server. Then we're going to move on, look at how we can plug in roles into our application to authorize different people to different parts of the system. And then at the end of the thing, we're going to see how we can model this kind of different permissions in a better way than roles. And then if we have time, I have a couple of goodies for you, like using authentication with SignalR or in progressive web applications. We will see how we'll get there. Just another couple of things. First of all, we're going to look at some of the internals. I know that the generally the level of the audience of DotNext is very high, so I'm really glad that we can have time to look at the internals. But don't worry if you are not really experienced with Blazor. I'll try to make sure that I can also cover the basics of these topics, so that regardless of your level of experience, you should be able to follow the talk and hopefully also take something interesting back home after this hour we're going to spend together. So how are we going to do that? Well, I'm going to show you in the slides how things work initially, and then we will see how they unfold in Visual Studio and when running a real application. So let's get started with talking about the components that we have available in Blazor when dealing with these subjects. So the first and the most important one that we need to familiarize with is the Authorized View. And the Authorized View is basically well, first of all, it's a component, obviously, so it's something that we can embed in a page. And the benefit of Authorized View is basically, well, it has two benefits. First of all, it provides us with a couple of templates that we can use to display different content depending on the authorization level of the user. So if the user is not authenticated, for example, we can show you, we can taunt him in this way, or otherwise we can display him a greeting message like this one. And here we can see also the second feature of Authorized View. So it provides us with this context object that basically gives us access to the claims principle of the application. So here's where we can get. So this is this user object is our well-known claims principle. So we can access the identity, we can look at the claims and things like that. And the other interesting couple of objects we can use for authorization and authentication concerns are the authorized attribute. Well, I'm sure that if you guys are like me and come from a web API or an MVC background, you're super familiar with authorized, so I wouldn't spend much time on that. So we can just add this attribute to our pages, and that will regulate who can access those pages. And it works together with this other component, which is called the Authorized root view, which basically it's a mix between the authorized view that we've seen in the previous slide and the root view. So what does it mean? It means that it will basically look for this authorized attribute that we have set on the page, and in case you don't meet the authorization criteria, you will see basically this message not authorized. And just one last thing, since in the web, especially in single-page applications, the authentication and authorization process is typically asynchronous, so it involves calls to other systems, for example, your identity provider, etc. There's also another, a second template, which is called authorizing, to display something in the meantime that the authorization process is taking place. Now, just one important thing, this authorized attribute only works in the context of routing. So when I'm navigating to a page. So this means that, as you know, since you can add a component either as a page to Blazor, but you can actually embed it in another page. So this will only be evaluated when navigating to a page. So if, for example, this is a counter, if I add this counter component to a page without the authorized attribute, I would see it even though there's this authorized thing here, right? So it's a common mistake, so we must be very, very aware of what we're doing with this attribute. How do they work under the hood? Well, these components that we talked about, they all rely on a class called the Authentication State Provider, which is a relatively simple class. So it just contains mainly, it contains two members. One is this get authentication state async, and this basically returns the current principle of the application, and the other one is an event that we can subscribe to understand when things have changed. As you can see, this is an abstract class, and the reason being for that is that basically, as you know, there are two different flavors of Blazor. There's Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly. They are very, very different in terms of the underlying technology, even though they look the same from the coding perspective, and therefore there will be different implementations of this class depending on the technology, so that we can use the same components that we've seen before, regardless of which flavor of Blazor we use. Okay, cool. So let's have a look at how things work in Blazor Server. So in Blazor Server, as you know, we have a browser, and this browser is connected to a Blazor engine which runs on the server, and this connection happens via SignalR, right? Now, let's assume that, so we have an authentication cookie stored in our browser, and the reason why this could happen is because obviously Blazor Server needs to be hosted in ASP.NET Core, and so let's assume that I'm authenticated with ASP.NET Core. Now, what happens is that, and this is a feature of strictly of SignalR, when there is such a cookie and I'm connecting to a hub in on the server side, this cookie is used to hydrate a claims principle on the server side. So forget Blazor, SignalR just provides this out of the box. In your hub, if you write some code, you will have access to the context, and the hub context will contain the claims principle if the user is authenticated. Now, this means that the implementation of the authentication state provider, you remember the abstract class we were talking about before, for Blazor Server can be extremely simple. So there is an implementation called Server Authentication State Provider which just exposes an additional method called Set Authentication State, so that this component hub can really just set a property to this authentication state provider. So in a nutshell, in a Blazor server, the authentication is managed entirely by ASP.NET Core and SignalR, and Blazor just needs to plug this claims principle into the authentication state provider, so that the other components that we've seen, the Authorized View, Authorized Root View, etc., will keep working as normal, right? So this brings us to this question. So which are the providers that are supported then in Blazor server? Well, obviously, since this is all based on SignalR and ASP.NET Core, anything that works with ASP.NET Core will work with Blazor server as well. So this means that we're going to have support for ASP.NET Core Identity, Azure Active Directory, Azure Active Directory B2C, and pretty much anything else that has a provider that works with ASP.NET Core, right? Cool. So let's try to have a look at this in action. And so let's go to a solution here. So I built a very simple solution in Visual Studio, in which I have my project here that runs on Blazor server. And if we look at, well, let's start it in the first place and see how it works. So as you can see, I have my login button here. And if I try to go to the counter page, I see that I'm sorry, but you cannot see this page. And this is because if I go back to my solution and I look at the counter page, I've set my authorized attribute here. And that's only the first ingredient, as you remember. The second ingredient is that in my app.razor, where I define the routing, I have my authorized root view here, which has this template that is triggered when I'm not authorized, right? And then I have this link here on the top to log in. If I click on that, as you can see now, I'm no more in Blazor. I'm in a plain ASP.NET Core identity authentication page. So I can click login, and as soon as I'm logged in, I can see a greeting message here. And if we look at how this greeting message is implemented, let's have a look back at the code here. So there's this shared component called the login display. As you can see here, we're using the authorized view, right? In which if I'm authorized, I access the context, the user identity name to display this message. And if I'm not authorized, I just display the two links for ASP.NET Core identity to either register or perform my login. So this is how it works on the surface. If we want to go a bit deeper on the code and have a look at the startup here, in the startup code, let's focus just on this this particular line, right? In which I'm adding an authentication state provider, and this is the nasty name of the class that I'm using for the authentication state provider. Now, I didn't lie to you. So this is just a further development of the server authentication state provider that we talked about during the slides. If we look in the inheritance tree, we see that it eventually inherits from a server authentication state provider, and this class effectively exposes this set authentication state, which is called by the hub to set the user, the current user for Blazor. And what this other more specialized implementation brings in is just support for a few additional ASP.NET Core features, such as the remote sign out, things which are very specific to ASP.NET Core. But conceptually, you see there's a validation for the security timestamp, security stamp claim type for the user. But under the hood, the way it works is how we pictured it in the slides. Right? Cool. I know that I've been very, very quick with Blazor server, but again, bear with me, because the interesting part is obviously Blazor WebAssembly. So let's focus on this, which I think it's the most cool flavor, most cool implementation of Blazor that we have today, right? So Blazor WebAssembly, as we know, runs entirely in the browser, right? It's the capability, WebAssembly is the standard that allows our C# code to be compiled in MSIL, and then we have the .NET Core CLR, which runs in the browser and is capable of running our code, basically. And so per se, first thing, it's obviously not capable of handling any kind of authentication. We can't store, obviously, users on the browser, so we have to rely on a third party, on a second service to perform the authentication. And for the sake of our talk, let's think about using the identity server, all right? And how are we going to talk with the identity server? Which obviously, so it's again just for this presentation, it could be literally anything else, Azure Active Directory or so on and so forth. Well, to talk with identity server, Blazor uses a JavaScript library. You hear me well. It's JavaScript called the OIDClient.js, which is basically the standard, the industry standard to implement the OpenID Connect, to implement the client for the OpenID Connect protocol on JavaScript. All right, and so this library is open source. It's on GitHub. It's not made by Microsoft, by the way. And internally, we have an implementation of the authentication state provider, again, the abstract class that lets the magic of authentication happen, called Remote Authentication Service. And so it might sound complex as the implementation, but conceptually, even this class here is very, very, very simple. So what happens is that, let's assume that I've performed my authentication with the identity server. So I got my ID token, and the ID token is stored here within OIDC client. It uses internally the session storage of the browser. So all that we have to do within the remote authentication service is just using JS interop to query OIDC client and retrieve this currently logged in user. So per se, remote authentication service doesn't have much logic. It just queries OIDC client to retrieve the current logged in user, and that's really it, right? Together with that, we also have another interesting interface implemented by the remote authentication service, which is called the iRemote Authentication Service. And this one provides the methods to perform a sign in and sign out. And again, these will work with JS interop to just trigger the process within OIDC client, right? So it's just so the core logic entirely sits within this boundary here, right? Now, it turns out that we're pretty much never going to use sign in and sign out directly, because for WebAssembly, we have usually, and this is created automatically with the default template of Visual Studio, we have this page called authentication that internally uses another component called the remote authenticator view. And this component basically has an action property, which, as you can see, is bound to the action routing parameter here. And it's capable of triggering an OpenID Connect flow. So for example, if I want to perform a login, all I have to do is calling authentication /login. This /login will go here in my remote authenticator view, and this component will use the authentication state provider to trigger the login process with OIDC client.js. So this is how it works conceptually. Before going into the code, let's have a look at the providers which are supported for Blazor WebAssembly. And again, the key point is that we're not doing anything Microsoft specific, right? So we're just using a common library that supports OpenID Connect and OAuth 2. So it turns out that anything that implements these two protocols in a kind of a standard way can be used with Blazor WebAssembly. So I'm talking about identity server, Azure Active Directory, and Azure Active Directory B2C, even though these two use a different JavaScript client, but they also are supported. Right? Cool. So you heard me talking too much. I know it. in front of slides. So let's jump back into Visual Studio and have a look at some code here. So let me go back here in Visual Studio, and let's look at the solution that I have here. So first of all, I have let me close these tabs. So the first thing I have here is my identity provider project, and this identity provider project is basically identity server 3 actually in this version. And what I need to do in identity server is as a first thing, if you ever used it, you know that you will need to configure the client that you want to use. And as you can see here, I've configured a client for Blazor, in which I've set that my client ID is Blazor. The current type, which is the workflow I'm going to use for OpenID Connect, is a code, and a few other things. There are a couple of interesting bits here that are worth noting. One is the scopes that I want to enable for my application, so OpenID and profile, for example, in this case. And these scopes are defined here as identity resources, right? And the other thing is the redirect URI. So where does IS4 redirect me when after a successful authentication? And this, as you can see, is using still that page that we saw on the slides, this one, right? Because obviously the remote authenticator view is not only capable of triggering those actions, but also to react to the various callbacks that might happen during the authentication flow, like, for example, the login callback, right? So this is all we have to do in IS4. So it's pretty standard. So let's set it as a startup project and run it. Okay, now it is running. Now let's go to Blazor and have a look at the Blazor project that I have here. And in this Blazor project, what I've done is that in my program.cs, I need to basically configure the counterpart of the parameters that I just set in IS4. And as you can see, for example, here I'm setting the same client ID. I'm saying which is the authority that will sign the authentication token, and that I'm using also the response type of code. So this is the type of flow that OpenID Flow Connect flow that I'm going to implement. Apart from that, oh, and by the way, these are hard-coded in code. We will see later in during the presentation that can also be fetched from a configuration file. So you don't have to write them in code. It was just clearer this way. I was saying, apart from that, it's really exactly the same code as we had before, right? So, for example, if I look at at my pages and I look at my counter page, here I have my authorized attribute, and if I go and look at my routing, I still have my authorized route view. In this case, I'm just using this component. It's quite interesting how it's built. You can have a look. It's basically something that uses the navigation manager to redirect you to the login page. Apart from that, again, you can smell that it's exactly the same code as we had in Blazor server. So we can, for example, build a library of components and which are authorization aware and authentication aware, and they will work regardless of which flavor of Blazor we use. Okay? So in this case, for example, so if I run the application and I try to perform a login, as you can see from the link here, what we're doing, oops, sorry, let me try again. As you can see from, come on, disappeared. That's annoying. Yeah, as you can see from the link below here, this is just going to the authentication/login page. And again, the authentication page is the one that we saw on the slides, right? So the one that internally uses the remote authenticator view, right? And as soon as I click this link, I get into identity server 4. So as you can see now, I'm not in Blazor anymore. I'm in IS4. I perform my login here. And yeah, IS4 will ask me for my consent. Yes, I grant consent to the application. And now I'm capable of accessing the counter page if I I try to log out, and I try to access the counter page. This way, as you can see, I get redirected to the login page as I would expect, right? So this is pretty much how it works. Let's have just a quick look at the redirect to login component. It's pretty simple. So it's just using the navigation manager internally to navigate to the authentication/login page. Apart from that, again, it's very standard. Okay. Now, we managed to authenticate finally the user. However, we still can't do really much in a single page application if we don't interact with an API. So this is going to be our next goal. So what if we need to talk to an API? In order to be able to call an API, we need, as you know, an access token. And to retrieve an access token, we need this additional component here, this additional object here, the iAccess token provider, which is still implemented by the same remote authentication service class that we've been talking about so far. Okay, this interface exposes this request access token method, which is basically just triggering the auth flow with the OIDC client, so that OIDC client can request an access token to IIS4 for a given resource. Now, this access token is, as you know, completely opaque for my application. It just contains a set of claims for the resource that I want to call. So what I'm going to do next is that I'm going to make an HTTP request to my web API, just passing this access token. And since the access token contains internally the identity of the user, I will be basically able to impersonate the user during this call to the web API. So the web API will be able to look at the HTTP context, look at the user, and the user object will contain, hopefully, the claims principle, the same claims principle that we had in Blazor. Okay, so this is what we're gonna do in a moment. Before we do that, let me just point out that also in this case, we're pretty much never going to use this request access token method directly, because we have a higher level of abstraction to work with. And this is basically the authorization message handler. So what is this object? It's just a handler that goes into the HTTP client pipeline, right? Which will automatically understand when a resource that we need to call is protected, and if it is, it will request and embed a token for us, right? So we don't have to do really anything apart from configuring this guy. So let's have a look at how it works. So back to Visual Studio. And let's start, as usual, from the identity provider, and more specifically from my configuration page. So in this configuration page, as you can see, I've defined an API resource, which is called the Weather API, and it's meant to be protecting an external API. So the first thing that I need to do is making sure that my Blazor client can request a token for this API. And this is basically done by adding this on the allowed scopes for Blazor. And this is a list that I can customize however I want. I can define the custom scopes either here or other API resources and just add them here in the allowed scopes. But apart from that, there's really not much. Nothing else I have to do here in IS4. Then I have my Weather API project. And in my Weather API project, this is a plain ASP.NET Core Web API. What I've done is I configured the JotBearer authentication. Okay, it's still using the same authority as before, so it's our IS4, and it's looking for an audience for a token with an audience of Weather API, which is the scope that we've defined before. Then in this Web API, but again, this is not specific to Blazor, obviously, it's just a normal JotBearer token authentication. And then here in my Web API, what I've done is that I've also in my weather forecast controller, as you can see, I've added this authorized attribute so that this controller cannot be called by without any authentication. And to demonstrate that the token that I get here on the controller is actually containing the identity of the user, I've also done this thing here, in which in the response I also added the identity name of the user, of the calling user. Okay, right. So this is for so we sorted out the identity provider. We sorted out the API. Let's go and look at Blazor. What do I have to do here in Blazor? So back to my setting here, where I've added the OpenID Connect authentication, and the first thing I need to do is that I need to specify that I want to request this additional scope, right? So I do options, provider options dot default scopes, and here I can add my weather API. So this is to say to Blazor, look, OpenID Connect and profile that we used before are already injected, already present here in the default scopes. We don't have to add them, but obviously any customized scope needs to be added explicitly. Okay, so this is for the requests. Then we need to configure the mighty authorization message handler so that we can request these access tokens when I need to call my API. Now, how do I do that? Well, the first thing is adding, obviously, the configuration of my HTTP client for my weather API. And as a second thing, I obviously want to, oops, sorry, this one. So this will configure the HTTP client factory with this named client and this base address. And then what I'm saying here, okay, this is the same as typing builder services add singleton HTTP client. Every time I need an HTTP client, just make sure that you are returning this client to me. Okay, I'm doing create client weather API, which is this one. Okay, so that if I go to, for example, my fetch data page here, I just need to inject an HTTP client. This will be pre-configured for me against the endpoint I want to call. Good. The last thing we need to do is configuring the message handler, the authorization message handler. And the way we do it is with the code, with this code snippet here, in which we are adding a message handler of type authorization message handler. And what we're saying here is that basically every time we need to call an endpoint that is under this domain, localhost 5002, which is the same as the API, obviously, it needs to make sure there is a weather API, an access token with a weather API scope attached to it. Okay, so this is the concept. Apart from that, I really don't have to do anything else, right? So let's see if this works. In order to do that, I need to just switch here the startup option to make sure that we start all the projects all together and close the previous running instances. So let's do a Control F5 and see what happens if the demo codes are with us. Cool, so identity server has started, the web API has started, and as you can see, it's returning me a 401 because it requires the a jot token in the request. And now this is a bit annoying. Let's see if I can switch like this. And this is our Blazor application, which is running, and I'm currently not logged in. So let's open the developer tools and perform a login here. I'm going to log in as Bob. And let's go here. Now, as you can see here in the consent, I also get asked whether I want to grant consent to my weather API. Say yes. And now I'm back to Blazor, to the Blazor application. I go to fetch data, and as you can see, I got my Bob Smith name here in the response. And if I look at the call I just made to weather forecast, this call contains my bearer token here in the header, right? And this bearer token, if we look at it via a service like j.ms, actually contains the identity of the user, all right? So it's Bob Smith, the audience is weather API, what we were expecting, and contains a scope of weather API among the others, okay? This token, I just want to stress on the fact that we didn't have to do anything for this token to be embedded, and Blazor is automatically, it's always triggering OpenID client for this token. The OIDC client is caching it into the session storage here on the application. So as you can see, I have my access tokens, my ID tokens cached here. So that we just don't have to worry about. So they have, so this library has already this logic to cache it and to automatically renew, perhaps silently most of the times, these tokens when they expire. Okay, so literally it's kind of a it's a very, very simple way of dealing with these matters. Cool. So we managed what we achieved so far is that we finally are starting to make our application a bit more interactive, so we can even talk securely with an external API. But obviously, any real-world application needs something more, right? It's not just that. So we need, for example, the capability of handling different permissions, different level of users in order to determine who can access what, right? So let's talk about roles then, and the way roles are managed in this kind of applications changes depending on the standpoint and the perspective where we are looking at them. Okay, so for example, for identity server, from the standpoint of identity server, a role is pretty much just an additional claim that we add to a token. Okay. So we only need to make sure that this additional claim is embedded in our tokens so that they can be interpreted by the client applications, right? And for example, from the standpoint of the weather API, what we're going to do is that we're going to look at the token and grant access to that to a page, to an endpoint or not, depending on the value that this special claim will have. And the same goes here in our Blazor application. So basically what we will need to do is, first of all, configure identity server to make sure that it's kind of this special role claim is embedded both in the ID token and the access token. And then as a second stage, we're going to configure our weather API to make sure that it recognizes this token, this claim embedded in the access token, and grants access only if it has a certain value. And as a last thing, we're also going to make pretty much the same thing, do pretty much the same thing here in Blazor and configure this special claim as the role for our users. Okay, so we can grant selective access to these users. Cool. Let's see how this works. And in order to look at that, I need to do a couple of things. So first of all, I want to close my old instances, and I need to be very careful because if I close this, the conference will be, the talk will be over. So I always have the chills in my spine when I do that. The other thing is that I need to switch branch. So let me just commit the changes that we've done here and go to the branches and get a separate branch out of this one, right? Cool. So what are we going to do here? So let's start once again from the identity provider. And in the identity provider, again, in the config section, what we're going to say is that, for example, we want to embed the role claim type in the API resource, and we also want to include this role claim type to the set of claims that Blazor receives. So we could create a new scope for that, but I really don't feel it's the correct thing, because otherwise I mean, a client could decide if it needs to explicitly say that it wants to receive the roles, which is really not a great thing. The way we configure the set of claims that end up in an ID token is via this identity resource settings here. And more specifically, as you can see here, I've added a bunch of, there are a bunch of well-known identity resources already added. One of these is a profile. And basically what these guys are just a dictionary that has a key, which is the name of the scope, for example, profile, and internally they contain a collection of the claims that this profile scope will require. So probably the best thing to do, the easiest thing to do is something like this, in which we are customizing the identity resources profile with a custom class like this one, in which we are just inheriting from the standard one, and we are adding the jot claim types role. Okay, this is the only thing that we actually needed to do in IS4, because IS4 internally it's using ASP.NET Core identity. And if we look at the database that we're using internally, let's just have a quick look at it. This is the database. As you can see, we have already all the structures for our roles and the binding between the roles and users. And if I look at the content of this database, I have a handy query here. And as you can see, I already have added Alice to the role of user and Bob to the role of admin and user. Okay. So IS4 will just work with that. Cool. Let's go to the weather API then. And in the weather API, in the configuration, I haven't changed absolutely anything. All right, it's just the same thing as before. The only thing that I've modified here is that in my controller, I've added this authorized roles admin. So only an admin would be able to call this this endpoint. Okay, not the fact that the user is authenticated. It's just not enough now. Cool. Now let's go to the interesting part, which is Blazor. So what do we have in Blazor? I've made a few changes here. So first of all, for example, now I'm saying that if I look at the counter page, the counter page is requires a role of user to be added, to be accessed, and fetch data instead. Obviously, the page that calls the endpoint, the API endpoint, requires a role of admin, right? I've also made a change in the routing, because here in the routing now I am checking before redirecting the user to the login page. I'm checking whether the user is authenticated, because obviously I might be authenticated but not authorized to access a page. So I'm Alice, for example. I'm a user and I cannot access fetch data. So in this case, I don't want to get stuck in a loop that constantly sends me back to the login page where I'm just where I'm already authenticated. I just need to see a message like this one. Okay. And apart from that, if I go here in my program page, the program class of my Blazor client, the only other thing I need to do is saying, you know what, the claim that you need to use in order to determine which role the user belongs to is called role, which is the same that we configured in IS4, right? This is really it. So let's try to run this and see if it works. Let me close this window here as well. Don't need that anymore. So let's do a Control F5 and let's see what happens. Right. So right now we're not authenticated. So let me just log in as Alice this time. So as you remember, Alice is a role of user. So Alice grants consent to the application. And now that I'm Alice Smith, I can go here on my counter page and I can effectively access this counter page. But if I try to access my fetch data page, I get this not authorized message, which is what I would expect, right? And I've also added this page here, claims, in which I just display all the claims that I've received in my ID token. And as you can see, in my ID token, there's the fact that as a role, I'm a user. Okay, cool. So this apparently works. Let's log out and let's log in with Bob and see if we can also fetch the weather forecast, which looks particularly grim today in London. But I'm sure that in Moscow it doesn't look better than here. So let me do a login here with Bob. I say yes. Now let's try to see if I can access the fetch data page. I am. Come on, this is annoying. It says that I'm not authorized. What did we do wrong? Let's go to the counter page and I see the same thing. Doesn't look right, right? That's it. So if I look at the claims page, effectively, it seems that everything is correct. So I have a role which is a user and admin. And if I look at the what OIDC client has stored internally here, you see I have my profile here. Let me zoom in this a little bit. Oh, I need to expand it first. Effectively, the ID token looks correct. So why doesn't it work? Well, the reason why it doesn't work is that there is I think I would say that it's kind of a bug. I've even opened an issue on GitHub for Blazor, but there's an unclear way Blazor handles this response from IS4. So what it's basically doing is that it's ignoring that this is an array of strings, and it's just saving a single claim of role whose value is this string here. So this is not an array of user and admin. It's a string that starts with a square bracket, has a quote, then a user, then a comma, then admin, and then a square bracket. So obviously, this is not something we can recognize with our authorized attribute in the page. So we need to fix this. And the way we fix this is customizing the way Blazor creates a claims principle out of the user, which is stored in OIDC client, the one that we saw here in the developer tools, right? So how do we do that? Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention, as you can see here, I'm using a configuration file to configure all the other aspects. So have a look at the code later on how this is done. It's really handy. So how do we do that? What we need to do is adding an account claims principal factory. Account claims principal factory is the object that, again, transforms the user in OIDC client into a claims principal for Blazor. And I have created a custom one, which is this array claims principal factory object here. Right, so we need to add this claims principal factory of remote user account. And let's have a look at what I do internally in this object. So first of all, it inherits from the base implementation, right? And calls the base, and it has this create user async method that receives the object from OIDC client and needs to spit out the claims principal. And as you can see, what I'm doing is that I'm first of all calling the base implementation, right? So to retrieve the claims principal of the user, this is a claims principal here, right? And then what I'm doing is that I'm looking at the dictionary of additional properties. This contains the list of claims that are embedded in my source object, the one coming from JavaScript. And looking at them, if they are a type of JSON array, what I'm doing is that I'm removing the wrongly added claim that this base implementation has added, and I'm just replacing it with a number of claims, each one with the correct value. Now, it sounds I really didn't do a good job in explaining it in words, but it's really easier to see it in action rather than explaining it. So let me restart the application now. And let's go back to my WebAssembly app. let's log in again with the account of Bob Smith. And right now, if I go into my claims, what I get, instead of that nasty representation of the role, I get just the two role claims, one for user and one for admin. And this means that I hopefully now can access the counter as I would expect, and I can also fetch my data with the weather API. Okay, so we managed to finally work around this this problem of multiple roles assignment. Cool. So we are capable of effectively distinguishing between different levels of users in our application and granting different authorizations to them. However, any one of you that has worked with a role-based authorization has certainly faced the problem I'm going to talk about shortly. So I don't think that personally, I don't think that roles are a good way to model access rules in our application. Why is that? Well, let's recap what we've done. So we have assigned a user to one or more roles, and we receive these roles as claims. And since this point, it's all okay. Up to this point, it's all okay. But then we use these roles directly to regulate, to control the access to certain resources. So we end up saying, writing something like authorized role equals to admin. Okay, why is that wrong? Well, first of all, because what we end up with is that roles are sparse across the entire code base. Think about you having a web API of I don't know, 200 with 200 endpoints. Good luck with that. Each of these endpoints and controllers will have a authorized role equals to whatever in as attributes. So if I ask you, okay, what can an admin do, or what can a simple user do? It's really, really difficult. The only thing you can do is going through the entire code base. There's no escape from that, right? So this is the first problem. The second problem is that refactoring permissions, it becomes really, really hard. So because of the first point, you start to lose control of what can do, who can do what. And sometimes you even have inconsistencies, such as endpoints, which are perhaps available to users, but not to admins, right? And if someone asks you, okay, can we add a super user that can do this, but not that? Yeah, you still have to go through the entire set of endpoints that you have in your application. So it becomes really, really, really difficult. And also, what you want to typically do is making sure that the front end is also aware of what the user can do, so that we can hide or show portions of the user interface with depending on the role of the user. And this is absolutely not easy when we can't even tell what an admin can do without going through the entire code base. So the only way we can do this is literally duplicating the same authorization logic that we have in the backend, also in the front end. That's really not great. So how do we solve that? Well, we can solve it with the different modeling of these authorization rules called permissions. So what are permissions? Permissions are a centralized place to describe functional permissions to portions of the application. So, for example, as we can see here, we have a permission code can let passengers board on an airplane, and only a role of captain, first officer, or cabin crew member can do that, right? There's a typo here, sorry. Can fly an airplane is only allowed to a role of captain and first officer, and only if this other claim, blood alcohol level, is equal to 0, right? Or, for example, for our, in the case of the demos that we've been doing so far, a role could be something like, permission, sorry, could be something like can see forecast, okay, which is only allowed to roles of admin. And the good thing about permissions are that they can be applied directly to controllers and pages. So here, for example, I'm saying that in Web API, okay, this is my controller code, I can authorize the access to this weather forecast only to those who can see forecast, right? And in this case here, as you can see, I can only do it in Blazor. I can also do it, sorry, in Blazor, in which the access to my fetch data page is only allowed to people who have the permission of can see forecast. Okay. The other thing we want to do is exposing an endpoint from the backend called my permissions, for example, so that the front end can retrieve the permissions assigned to a user, and therefore they can know what a user can do. And this is an open source library I'm creating. I'm going to release it very, very shortly. So watch this space. I mean, so follow me on Twitter. I'm going to tell you when this is available, which is inspired by a commercial product called Policy Server. There's this is made by the same people behind IS4. There's a kind of a proof of concept in GitHub, right? And I've been using it with great satisfaction in a couple of client engagements so far, right? So, but the main point is that we are switching the point of view from who the user is, I'm an admin or I'm a user, to a functional, to an authorization based on a functional perspective. So do I have the permission to call this function? Do I have the permission to access this page? All right. So let's see how this works in our solution. And I need to, as usual, close this and switch to a separate branch. Maria, do I have another couple of minutes? I think so, hopefully.
Yes, sure. Take your time.
Cool. All right. So let's go to this permissions branch. And let's see what we have here. So first of all, from the identity provider perspective, there are no changes whatsoever. All right. This is exactly as it was before. And this is because this is it's more specific to the application logic rather than a responsibility of the web service that needs to confirm who the user, the identity of the user, and give me the identity card basically of this user with all its claims. So no changes here. In the Web API project, in Weather API, what I've done is that I've added this file called permissions, right? In which I have a can see forecast and can use counter. And here I'm saying that can see forecast is for people whose role is admin, and this one is for users and admins, right? And then if I look at my controller here, what I've done is that here I'm using the permission directly, right? So I'm saying that only people who can see a forecast can actually call this endpoint. And the way this works is that I'm basically using this overload. You can't really show you. It's kind of a mind-blowing transparency, but it's using the overload that accepts a policy, right? So this can see forecast is just a policy which is dynamically created out of the of this file here, which is in this case it's a separate file, by the way, but it just could be embedded in the app settings. All right. If we go and look at the startup, what I've done is that I've added this add permission policies. All right, and this add permission policies is a method in this open source library that I'm working on, which replaces the authorization policy provider, which is the class that ASP.NET Core calls every time it sees something like policy, like this one, right? To retrieve the policy object. And here I'm using this special permission policy provider that dynamically can create a policy out of the specs which are in that permissions.json file that we've seen. Okay, cool. Let's look at Blazor. So in Blazor, what I've done is that I made pretty much the same changes. So in my counter page, now I'm saying that only people who can use counter can access this page. And I've done the same here on the fetch data, as you can see. The other interesting bit is that now that I'm working on that I have a functional specification of a permission, it's very easy to implement a logic like Authorized View can use counter to display or hide the link to the counter page, depending on whether I have that permission or not. Now, I could have done this with a role as well, right? But then, obviously, if you asked me to refactor the role, you know what? Only admins can use counter. I would have needed to do it twice, both on the back end and in the front end. Whereas in this way, it's only centralized on the back end, and in the front end, I'm just using this abstraction of a can use counter to determine whether a user can see this link or not, right? Every time Blazor sees this policy being used, pretty much like ASP.NET Core uses a authorization policy provider to understand what this policy means, right? And here I've created this permission policy provider that internally is just looking at a special claim called permission, which sits on the claims principle. All right. So before we go a little bit deeper on that, let's have a look at this in action and see how it works. So if I run the application now and I log in, this time I log in as Bob Smith. So Bob Smith, as you remember, is an admin. As soon as I get here, I can see the links of counter and fetch data. All right. And I can obviously access those pages. If I look at the permissions, my user is assigned the permission of can see forecast and can use counters. And these are stored as claims within my, my claims principle. And the way we do that is, as we've seen before, the easiest way to manipulate what's in the claims principle object is via this array claim, our custom claims principle factory, right? So here, what we have is that after the logic that fixes the bug of arrays, I'm calling this /API/myPermissions endpoint that I make, that library exposes automatically in the API side to retrieve the permissions for the currently logged in user, right? So this means that if I, for example, log out, and this time I log in as Alice, I can only use the counter, I cannot fetch the weather forecast. As you can see here, I don't see the link to the weather forecast, right? So we easily manipulated the user interface in order to achieve that. And this is because the permission I have is only can use counter, okay? So again, I think that this is we use it in real world projects, a couple of quite complex projects, and it's a really easy way to manipulate and have a higher level of abstraction of what the user can do, which is not just the roles the user belongs to. Yeah. So, Maria, do we have any questions? Yeah.
We do actually. There's a question from Vladimir Rogozhin. He asks, I saw that you specify localhost as server address in WebAssembly OIDC client. Is it possible to make OIDC configuration dynamic so that it has different servers?
Absolutely.
Or is it
Absolutely.
always one?
Yes, absolutely.
So how do you do that?
Yeah, we can do it in a couple of ways. As you can see in this other demos, I've changed it to be read from a configuration file, right? So this configuration file needs to be sitting in the www root folder here of Blazor, of the Blazor project, and it is this appsettings.json. And in this case here, I've just specified these things, and you can easily replace it. For example, automatically with your CI and CD, you can just tokenize, for example, these parameters to work with the ones that you generate when you deploy to production or to the various environments.
Cool. Another question is from me, just to make sure this last thing that you've showed about the authorization with permissions, it is your code. It is not part of Blazor currently.
Yes, absolutely. It's a custom library. Well, if you go to GitHub, where this I provide you the link where
Could you send
this
the
entire
link
demo.
to the chat, please?
Absolutely,
It would be
absolutely.
really
It's part
nice
of the
to.
slides, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's talk about this. So first of all, you have some of the. So here there are a couple of links on some articles I've written on this subject on my personal blog. More articles coming soon. Here in this link, you can find the demos that you've seen so far during the presentation, and there's a branch for permissions where also the source code for this library is. It's kind of a preview version of it. Again, I'm going to release it as a separate project on GitHub pretty soon. So watch this space for when it's ready. You can start using it regardless. It's in this library here.
Cool. It looks really convenient to use. I have a rather maybe stupid question, but as far as I understand, this mechanism for authentication is rather new, right? It has been added like in this year. Is that correct? How did people do this previously? Did they like manually add the tokens into the requests, or?
You mean in Blazor or general
In Blazor?
or
In
these
Blazor.
permission things? Yeah, Blazor. So Blazor has had the support for authentication authorization pretty much since WebAssembly has been released earlier. Well, the first version of Blazor WebAssembly has been released. It has pretty much gone through also the .NET 5 release without any major changes. So it has been there pretty much since the beginning. For those of you who have been following the inception of Blazor WebAssembly and perhaps downloading the various release candidates, it has gone through a lot of changes during that phase, but now it's pretty stable and it's pretty much like that since yeah.
There's a follow-up question from Vladimir. Does the server always have to be available by local host in Blazor WebAssembly?
What do you mean by local host? I'm not entirely sure, but however, let's put it this way: the tokens that we see here on that we can use in Blazor, which are again retrieved through OIDC client .js, have an expiration date, right? So until the token expires, and this expiration date, the lifetime of a token can be configured in IS4 or in whichever other identity provider you're using. Pretty much all of them have this capability of configuring it, apart from Azure Active Directory, which has a fixed lifetime for tokens. Apart from that, the key point is that they have a life cycle. So a token expires, and after that, it's not longer valid. Now, OIDC client renews silently and automatically this token for us without the user even noticing it, right? But obviously, in order to do that, it means that the identity provider needs to be alive. Otherwise, our application will simply stop working. I have an example, and perhaps we can do that in the next Q&A session. Yeah, exactly, in the Zoom meeting. I have an example on how to deal with that with special cases such as, for example, progressive web applications, where you want your application to keep working even if the user is offline, for example, right? When the token is perhaps there, it's expired, but the user cannot renew it because he's I don't know, on his device without any network coverage. And there are some techniques to do that.
Okay. So I'm not sure if we have time for another question. So I had a small question whether different identity providers that are supported by Blazor, are they really different from the point of view of user, or you just use whatever is more popular, or
No,
you have your
exactly.
favorites?
So yeah, so from the point of view of the code that you write, again, the only touch point is mostly on the configuration that you have to put on your program section and on your obviously on the configuration files. But the good point is that no matter how complex your application is, as you can see, the logic that you put on your pages is based on abstractions that don't rely on the specific identity provider that you're using. Personally, we use it with Azure Active Directory a lot, but simply because the vast majority of the applications we built are line of business applications and enterprise applications, which need to work with the single sign-on of an enterprise, and therefore Azure Active Directory was the perfect choice for that. Again, it also works for public-facing websites with either Azure AD B2C or IS4.
Okay, great.
Well, thank you guys.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it was fantastic. It was amazing and very interesting. And I believe that, guys, you have a lot of discuss in Zoom in discussion zone. And as far as I understand, Marco, you have some more goodies to show for the guys in Zoom, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So first of all, let me thank you all, guys, for this journey that we've done together in the last hour and so. And yeah, if you have time, I have another couple of interesting things, such as how do we use authentication with SignalR or the progressive web apps thing, which might be interesting for some of your applications. So yeah, feel free to join.
Yeah, well, right after the closing, I will join the Zoom to talk to you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot.
See you there.